My name is Dr. Alistair Finch, and I am the man who shattered a mother's angel. It wasn't a metaphor, it was a cheap ceramic figurine of a guardian angel, the kind you'd find in a dusty corner of a thrift store, and I threw it to the ground with all the force my 58 years of arrogance could muster. It happened in the sterile, unforgiving hallway of the intensive care unit at Metropolitan General, where I serve as Chief of Cardiology. The sound it made, that sharp, definitive crack of porcelain on polished linoleum, was, for me, the sound of truth. It was the sound of my truth, the only one I had ever known, that faith, hope, and prayer were fragile, hollow things that break just as easily as bone. And I did it right in front of the boy's mother, Sarah. I watched her face crumble as the pieces scattered, and I told her with the cold precision of a surgeon that the only reality was inside that room, on the monitors that had already flatlined, pronouncing her son clinically dead. I wanted her to see what I saw, that her prayers were a flimsy bandage on a mortal wound, and that her God had just gone silent. If you find a story like this compelling, or if you've ever found yourself questioning the line between science and faith, I ask that you subscribe to this channel and like this video. It helps more than you know. And as you listen, please, share in the comments where you're from. I'd genuinely like to know who is hearing my story. My life, up until that moment, was a fortress built of empirical data. My world was one of EKGs, angiograms, and peer-reviewed studies. I graduated summa cum laude from Harvard Medical School, completed my residency at Johns Hopkins, and built a career on the unshakable foundation of science. To me, the human body was a magnificent, intricate machine, but a machine nonetheless. When it broke, you either fixed it with the tools and knowledge you had, or it stopped working. There was no ghost in the machine. God was a failed hypothesis, a comforting story we told ourselves to cope with the terrifying randomness of existence. Faith was a placebo, a psychological crutch for the weak-minded who couldn't face the cold, hard facts of biology. I wasn't just an atheist, I was an evangelist for disbelief. I saw it as my duty, in a way, to disabuse people of their comforting delusions, especially when those delusions stood in the way of medical reality. This rigid worldview was my armor, and I wore it proudly. I lived in a penthouse overlooking the city, a sterile, minimalist space filled with books on quantum physics and evolutionary biology, not Bibles or crucifixes. My relationships were transactional, my friendships based on intellectual sparring rather than emotional connection. I was respected, even feared in my field. They called me brilliant, a genius with a scalpel. But behind closed doors, the nurses whispered that I had a scalpel for a soul, and they weren't wrong. I saw emotion as a variable that clouded judgment, a messy, unpredictable element in the clean equation of life and death. And nowhere was this conviction more tested and more violently asserted than in the case of a 17-year-old boy named Leo. Leo was brought to my unit with a heart so ravaged by viral cardiomyopathy that it was barely functioning. It was a textbook case of a catastrophic organ failure. His ejection fraction was in the single digits. His heart was a swollen, tired muscle giving its last, desperate beats. My team and I did everything. We put him on every drug, tried every advanced therapy, but his body was shutting down. I gave him 48 hours tops. It wasn't a guess, it was a statistical certainty. And I delivered this news to his mother, Sarah, with the same dispassionate clarity I used in my lectures to medical students. But Sarah refused to accept it. She was a woman of what I considered to be a toxic, almost delusional faith. She turned Leo's ICU room into a makeshift shrine. There were rosary beads draped over the IV pole, a worn Bible on his bedside table, and that small ceramic guardian angel clutched in her hand like a lifeline. She prayed constantly, her whispers a constant, irritating hum against the rhythmic beeping of the failing monitors. She told the nurses that God was going to perform a miracle. I saw her hope not as a beautiful testament to a mother's love, but as a cruel and dangerous form of denial. I saw it as my responsibility to break through it, to prepare her for the inevitable. Our conflict escalated over 2 days. I would enter the room to give her a clinical update, and she would counter my data with scripture. I'd explain the cellular degradation of his myocardial tissue, and she'd tell me about the healing power of Jesus. It was infuriating. It felt like trying to explain calculus to someone who insisted the world was flat. The final confrontation happened on the second night. I had just come from reviewing Leo's latest scans. They were even worse. His heart was, for all intents and purposes, dead. I walked into the hallway to find Sarah standing outside his room, weeping but still clutching that ridiculous angel. "He's gone, Sarah," I said, my voice devoid of any softness. "It's over. You need to let go." She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No," she whispered. "My angel is watching over him. God won't abandon him." And that's when I snapped. All my frustration, all my condescending pity, all my rigid certainty boiled over into a single contemptuous act. I snatched the figurine from her hand. It felt light, insignificant, just like the belief it represented. I held it up between us. "This?" I sneered, my voice echoing in the quiet corridor. "This piece of painted plaster is not going to save your son. Science is the only truth here, and the truth is your son is gone." And with that, I threw it to the floor. The sound of it shattering, that sharp, percussive crack, filled the silence. I wanted that sound to be the final word, the exclamation point on my lecture of reality. I wanted to destroy her hope so that the truth could finally get through. I stood there, breathing heavily, looking from her horrified face to the porcelain shards scattered like tiny white bones on the floor, utterly convinced of my own righteousness. But in that ringing silence, something else happened. Something impossible, something that would shatter not a ceramic angel but the very foundation of my entire life. Remember to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications if you want to hear the rest of this. And please, let me know in the comments where you are watching from. It means a lot to connect with you all. The silence that followed was heavier than any sound I had ever known. It wasn't empty. It was filled with the weight of what I had just done, with the horrified gasps of the nurses, with the profound, shattered grief on Sarah's face. For a split second, a flicker of triumphant certainty warmed me. I had done it. I had broken through her denial with the cold, hard hammer of reality. I stood there, the self-appointed executioner of false hope, waiting for the finality of it all to sink in. But the finality that came was not the one I expected. From inside Leo's room, a sound cut through the tension. It wasn't the flat, monotonous drone of an empty signal. It was a single, strong, rhythmic beep. My head snapped toward the monitor, visible through the glass. A nurse beside me gasped. I took a step forward, my eyes locked on the screen, my brain refusing to process the data it was receiving. A single beep became 2, then 3, a perfect, steady cadence. The jagged, chaotic line of ventricular fibrillation, the signature of a dying heart, was gone. In its place was a waveform so clean, so powerful, it could have been from a textbook diagram. A perfect sinus rhythm. My mind, my greatest asset, became a frantic, cornered animal, scrambling for an explanation. Machine malfunction? It was a brand new top-of-the-line telemetry unit, calibrated that morning. A delayed drug reaction? Impossible. We had pushed every last amp of epinephrine and vasopressin. The window for a response had closed long ago. A spontaneous electrical reset. The odds were less than 1 in a billion, a statistical ghost story doctors told but never witnessed. Then, through the glass, I saw it. Movement, a flicker of an eyelid. Leo's hand, which had been lying limp and waxy, twitched. Another nurse, a young resident I'd been mentoring, pushed past me and rushed into the room. My own feet felt bolted to the floor, cemented there by a disbelief so profound it felt like paralysis. I watched, a spectator in my own hospital, as the resident checked Leo's pulse, his eyes wide with shock. He looked back at me, his mouth agape, and just nodded. It was real. The pulse was strong, and then the ultimate refutation of everything I knew to be true. Leo's eyes opened. They weren't glazed or unfocused. They were clear. He blinked slowly, and his head turned toward the door. His voice was weak, a dry rasp, but the words were unmistakable. "Mom." The world tilted on its axis. Every law of biology, every medical textbook, every lecture I had ever given, turned to ash in that single moment. Sarah, who had been frozen in horror, let out a sound that was half sob, half cry of pure joy, and ran into the room, collapsing by her son's bedside. I was left alone in the hallway, standing amidst the shards of the broken angel. My armor of empiricism had been vaporized. I was no longer the brilliant Dr. Finch, chief of cardiology. I was just a man, stripped bare, staring into the face of an absolute impossibility. The nurses who had feared me now looked at me with something else, pity maybe, or a kind of fearful awe. I had become an unwilling witness to something sacred, right after committing an act of desecration. The days that followed were a blur of humiliating confusion. I personally oversaw every test. I took Leo for another echocardiogram myself, my hands trembling slightly as I guided the probe over his chest. I stared at the screen, expecting to see a catastrophically damaged heart somehow barely functioning. What I saw was impossible. The tissue was pink and healthy. The ventricular walls, which had been stretched and thin, were thick and strong. The ejection fraction, a measure of the heart's pumping ability, which had been in the single digits, was now at 55%, the low end of normal for a healthy teenage athlete. It was like looking at a photograph of a ruin that had, overnight, rebuilt itself, stone by perfect stone. There was no scar tissue, no sign of the viral damage that had ravaged it. Medically, scientifically, it was as if the cardiomyopathy had never happened. My colleagues wanted answers. I was the expert. I was the one who was supposed to explain the unexplainable. But I had nothing. I would stand in conferences, presenting the before and after scans, and the room would fall into a stunned silence. They'd ask for my hypothesis. Was it an undiscovered regenerative cellular process? A rare genetic anomaly? I would just stand there, mute. My life, once a rigid, predictable equation, had been contaminated by a variable I couldn't name. I started avoiding the ICU. I couldn't walk down that hallway without seeing the ghostly outline of the shattered angel on the floor, without hearing that impossible beep that signaled the end of my world. My penthouse felt less like a sanctuary and more like a tomb. The books on my shelves, filled with the cold, hard facts of the universe, now felt like a collection of elaborate fairy tales. My certainty, the very bedrock of my identity, had been pulverized, and in its place was a terrifying, gaping void. I was completely, utterly alone, shipwrecked on an island of impossibility, with the silence of my own failed logic ringing in my ears. If this part of my journey resonates with you, and you want to know what happened in the wake of this collapse, please show your support with a like and hit that notification bell so you don't miss what comes next. My nights became a waking nightmare. Sleep offered no escape, only replays of that moment in the hallway, the sound of the shattering ceramic, the look on Sarah's face, the impossible beep of the monitor. I stopped going to the hospital unless absolutely necessary. I cancelled lectures. I let my residents handle rounds. My penthouse, once my monument to sterile reason, became my prison. The floor-to-ceiling windows that once offered a triumphant view of the city now just showed me a world I no longer understood. I'd stand there for hours, a glass of scotch in my hand, watching the tiny, orderly lights of the cars below, and feel a profound and terrifying disconnect. Everything out there was following rules, obeying the laws of physics I held so dear. But I had seen a law broken. I had seen a truth that my books couldn't explain, and the silence in my apartment was deafening. I was a ghost in my own life, haunted by a miracle. One night, the loneliness was a physical weight. I had been drinking more than usual, not for the buzz, but to try and quiet the relentless loop of questions in my mind. Coincidence? A statistical anomaly? A freak biological event? I repeated the words like a mantra, but they were hollow, empty shells. They couldn't contain the truth of what I had seen in Leo's eyes, in the vibrant, healthy tissue on his scans. I sank into my leather armchair, the one where I'd read Dawkins and Hitchens with smug satisfaction, and I felt the full force of my own intellectual bankruptcy. I had built my entire identity on a foundation of sand, and the tide had just come in. I closed my eyes, not in prayer. I still didn't know how, but in complete and utter surrender. I had no more arguments, no more theories. I was just a broken man in a dark room, and that's when it happened. It wasn't a dream. I was painfully awake. It started not as a sight, but as a feeling, a warmth that began in the center of my chest, spreading through my limbs, chasing away the chill that had settled into my bones for weeks. It was a presence, so palpable, so real, that I was certain someone had entered the room. I opened my eyes, expecting to see an intruder, but the room was empty. Yet the feeling intensified. It was a presence of immense, overwhelming love, and it was feminine. It was the feeling a child must have when held by its mother after a terrible fall, a feeling of absolute safety, of unconditional acceptance. There was no judgment for my arrogance, no condemnation for my cruelty. There was only a profound and gentle sorrow, not for me, but with me. Then a light began to form in the corner of the room. It wasn't a harsh, bright light, but a soft, luminous glow like moonlight pouring through a window that wasn't there. Within the light, an image began to coalesce. It was a woman. She was beautiful, but not in a worldly sense. Her face held an expression of such profound mercy and compassion that it buckled my soul. She wasn't looking at me with accusation. She was looking at me with the same heartbreaking pity I had seen in Sarah's eyes, but this was amplified 1,000 times, purified into something divine. She didn't speak a word, but I understood. In that silent gaze, I saw my entire life laid bare, my pride, my lonely ambition, my contempt for the faith of others. I saw the shattering of the angel not as an act of intellectual superiority, but as a pathetic, childish tantrum against a God I had pretended not to believe in. And I saw the miracle of Leo's healing not as a random event, but as a direct personal response. Not to Sarah's prayers alone, but to my act of desecration. It was an answer so powerful, so grand, it had to use the language of impossibility to get through my thick skull. The grace wasn't for Leo, it was for me. The shame that washed over me was a tidal wave. It wasn't the petty embarrassment of being proven wrong. It was the soul-crushing agony of seeing your own ugliness in the reflection of perfect love. I slid from the chair onto the floor, my body convulsing with sobs I hadn't known I possessed. I wept for the man I had been, for the cruelty I had shown, for the beautiful, fragile hope I had tried to extinguish. I wept until I was empty, a hollowed-out vessel on the floor of my expensive, meaningless life. And through it all, the gentle, luminous presence remained, not judging, just waiting. How long I stayed there, I don't know. But the first light of dawn was beginning to grey the sky when the intercom buzzed, a jarring electronic sound in the sacred silence. I stumbled to the wall panel, my voice a raw croak. "Who is it?" The voice that came back through the speaker was the last one on earth I expected to hear. "Dr. Finch, it's Sarah, Leo's mother." Can I come up for a moment?" My heart stopped. I was certain she had come to condemn me, to finally unleash the anger she was so entitled to feel. My hand trembled as I pressed the button to open the lobby door. A few minutes later, there was a soft knock. I opened the door to find her standing there holding a small white gift box. She looked at my disheveled state, my tear-stained face, and her expression wasn't one of triumph or anger. It was one of concern. "Are you all right, Doctor?" she asked, her voice gentle. I couldn't speak. I just shook my head, stepping aside to let her in. She walked into the living room and placed the box on my coffee table. "I came to thank you," she said. "I know we had our disagreements, but you were the doctor in charge of his care, and he's home now. He's alive." She pushed the box toward me. I wanted you to have this." My fingers felt numb as I lifted the lid. Inside, on a bed of cotton, lay the pieces of the shattered angel. They had been meticulously, lovingly glued back together. The cracks were still visible, a web of fine, golden lines where the pieces had been joined. It wasn't perfect. It was broken and healed. "It's not the same," she said softly, "but it's whole again. I wanted you to know that there's nothing so broken that it can't be made whole again." And in that moment, I knew. This was it. The tangible confirmation. The divine mercy in my living room, holding out a broken angel mended with gold. This was the moment everything truly began to shift. If you want to see how this encounter changed my life, my medicine, and my soul, please hit that like button and turn on notifications so you won't miss the conclusion of my story. After Sarah left, I stood in the center of my living room for a long time, the mended angel resting in my palm. It felt heavier than it should have. My first instinct, the reflex of a lifetime of skepticism, was to fight back. My mind, my trained, logical, Harvard-educated mind, went to war. The vision, a classic stress-induced hallucination. I was sleep-deprived, grieving the death of my certainty, and had been drinking. My subconscious, riddled with guilt over my cruelty to Sarah, simply conjured a maternal archetype, a psychological projection to soothe a psyche in crisis. It was textbook. I could have written a paper on it. The miracle with Leo, a statistical outlier, a 1 in a billion spontaneous remission. In a universe of infinite possibilities, the improbable is not impossible, it's inevitable. I had just been unlucky enough to have a front row seat, and Sarah's return with the mended angel? A simple act of human kindness, nothing more. A gesture of forgiveness that I had twisted into some kind of divine punctuation mark. It was all explainable. It had to be. But my explanations felt like thin, brittle shields against a relentless truth. Every time I closed my eyes, I didn't see data or textbooks. I saw her face, the woman in the light, and I felt that love, that impossible, unconditional mercy that had unmade me. It wasn't a memory of a hallucination. It was the memory of a reality more real than the floor beneath my feet. I started having dreams, not of monitors and medical charts, but of light. In one, I was back in the ICU hallway throwing the angel to the ground, but instead of shattering, it dissolved into 1,000 points of light that swirled around me, warm and silent. I would wake up with my heart pounding, not with fear, but with a profound and inexplicable sense of peace. The mended angel sat on my coffee table, a constant, silent sentinel. I tried to put it in a drawer, but my hand would stop. It was more than ceramic and glue now. It was a relic of my own breaking and a testament to a grace I hadn't earned. The shame was the worst part. It was a slow-acting poison. I would be trying to read a medical journal, and a memory would surface with the force of a physical blow. I remembered mocking a young nurse for wearing a small cross, asking her if she really thought a first-century carpenter was a better diagnostician than I was. I saw the hurt in her eyes, a look I had dismissed at the time as weakness. I remembered telling a grieving husband that his wife's last rites were a meaningless ritual, a superstition that was getting in the way of the hospital's workflow. I saw myself over and over, standing in that hallway, my face twisted in a sneer of intellectual superiority, snatching that symbol of hope from a mother's hand. Each memory was a fresh wound. My pride, which had been my armor, now felt like a coat of acid, burning me from the inside out. I had believed I was a man of truth, but I saw now that I was just a bully, hiding his own terror of the unknown behind a wall of facts and figures. One afternoon, the silence of my apartment became unbearable. The fortress I had built to logic had become a torture chamber of self-recrimination. I couldn't stay there. I put on my coat, slipped the mended angel into my pocket, and just walked out with no destination in mind. I walked for hours, block after block, letting the anonymous rhythm of the city swallow me. And then I looked up and saw where my feet had taken me. It was the old Cathedral of St. John, a massive stone structure I had passed 1,000 times, always with a dismissive glance at its Gothic spires and what I considered to be its antiquated foolishness. I had always seen it as a monument to delusion. Now I saw something else. I saw a place built not on certainty but on mystery, a place for the broken. I stood on the sidewalk for a long time, the cold wind whipping around me, my heart hammering against my ribs. To cross that threshold would be the ultimate surrender. It would be an admission that my entire life had been wrong. If you've ever felt that kind of internal battle, that pull between what your mind tells you and what your heart knows, let me know with a like and be sure to hit that notification bell, because the peace that comes after the storm is worth waiting for. My hand was on the massive, cold iron handle of the cathedral door. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to return to the safety of my predictable world. But the man who lived in that world was a stranger to me now. I pushed the door open. It swung inward with a low groan, and I stepped inside. The air was cool and still, thick with the scent of old stone, incense and beeswax. Light, fractured into jewels of ruby and sapphire and gold by the stained glass windows, painted the stone floor in silent, shifting patterns. It was vast and quiet, the noise of the city completely gone, replaced by a profound, echoing silence. I felt small, insignificant, an intruder in a sacred space. My whole life, I had been the one with the answers, the one people looked to in awe. Here, my degrees and my reputation meant nothing. I was just a man, stripped of his arrogance, standing in a place he did not understand. My eyes slowly adjusted to the dim light. I saw the rows of empty pews, the flickering votive candles like tiny captured stars. I saw the statues, figures frozen in silent prayer or suffering. I had always called them idols, crude representations for the uneducated. But now, I saw the artistry, the love that had carved them. My gaze fell upon a side altar, where a statue of a woman stood, her head bowed slightly, her hands open in a gesture of welcome. She was holding a rosary, and her expression was one of gentle, sorrowful love. It wasn't the face from my vision, not exactly, but the feeling it evoked was the same. That same overwhelming, heartbreaking mercy. My scientific mind tried one last, desperate rebellion. It's just plaster and paint, Alistair. It's an archetype designed to elicit this exact emotional response. But the argument had no power here. I reached into my pocket, and my fingers closed around the rough, cracked surface of the mended angel. Here was the plaster and glue that defied explanation. I walked slowly, hesitantly, down the aisle and slid into a pew at the back, the wood cool and smooth beneath my hand. I didn't kneel, I didn't know how, I just sat there in the colored light, in the holy silence, and for the first time in my life I stopped trying to explain. I just listened. I wasn't listening for a voice. I was listening to the silence, letting it wash over me, cleaning out the dark, cluttered corners of my soul. And in that silence, a single silent admission finally broke free. I was wrong. I was wrong about everything. It wasn't a defeat. It was a release. The battle was over. And in the quiet surrender, something new, something fragile and terrifying and beautiful began to take root in the ruins of the man I used to be. That day in the cathedral, I didn't find religion. I lost a war. The war I had been waging my entire life against the possibility of God. Leaving that sacred silence and stepping back out into the noise of the world was like being born. The colors of the city seemed sharper, the faces of strangers more profound. But my new world was not without its own battles. News travels fast in a hospital. The story of the brilliant, arrogant doctor Finch, who had a breakdown in the ICU hallway after a patient's spontaneous recovery, became the stuff of legend. At first it was whispered gossip. Then it became a direct confrontation. My former protégé, a sharp young doctor named Evans, cornered me in my office. He was genuinely concerned. "Alistair," he began, his voice laced with clinical pity, "we need to talk about what happened. The stress, the guilt, it can trigger dissociative episodes. A guilt-induced psychosis isn't unheard of. He was offering me an out, a diagnosis that would neatly file the miracle away into a box labeled pathology. He was offering me my old life back. The old me would have seized it, used it as a shield. But I just looked at him, my heart filled not with anger but with a strange sadness for him, for the blindness I once shared. "It wasn't a psychosis, Mark," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "It was the most real experience of my life." He shook his head, frustrated. "It was a 1 in a billion statistical anomaly. You can't throw away your entire career, your entire life's work, for a coincidence." But I knew it wasn't, and I didn't argue. I didn't present evidence, I just held the truth of it in my heart. A quiet, unshakable certainty. I started spending more time at the cathedral. At first, I would just sit in the back, an observer. I watched people come and go, the old woman lighting a candle for a loved one, the young man kneeling in desperate prayer. I saw their faith not as a crutch, but as an anchor in a stormy sea. The symbols I had once despised began to speak to me. The crucifix wasn't a morbid obsession with death. It was a radical statement about a love so powerful it would endure the worst of humanity to prove its point. The statues weren't idols. They were reminders, family portraits of those who had walked this path of faith and finished the race. One day, the parish priest, a kind white-haired man named Father Michael, sat down in the pew beside me. He didn't ask what I was doing there. He didn't try to convert me. He just said, "It's a beautiful place to be quiet, isn't it?" And in that simple acceptance, I found a home. I started attending Mass, fumbling with the prayers, standing when others knelt, a clumsy apprentice in the school of humility. I was welcomed into a community of simple, good people. They knew my story, some of it anyway, but they didn't see me as the disgraced doctor. They saw me as Alistair, a man seeking. The true turning point came a few months later at the annual Parish Fall Festival. It was held in the church basement, a chaotic, joyful scene filled with the smell of baked ziti and coffee, the sound of children laughing, and the warmth of genuine community. It was a million miles away from the sterile, high-powered fundraising galas I used to attend. Father Michael got up to say a few words, and then, to my horror, he looked directly at me. "We have a new member of our family with us tonight," he said, his voice warm. "And I think he has a story he might want to share." Every eye in the room turned to me. My heart hammered in my chest. This was it, the moment of truth. I could have declined, mumbled an excuse, and shrunk back into the shadows. But I thought of Sarah. I thought of Leo. I thought of the luminous face in my apartment. I walked to the front of the room, my hands trembling. I looked out at their faces, 100 pairs of eyes waiting. "My name is Alistair Finch," I began, my voice cracking slightly. For most of my life, I was a man of science, a man of pride. I believed that faith was a delusion, and I treated those who held it with contempt. I took a deep breath. There was a woman, a mother named Sarah, whose son was dying under my care, and in my arrogance, I took from her a small symbol of her faith, a ceramic angel, and I shattered it on the floor in front of her. I wanted to shatter her hope. I wanted to prove that my reality was the only one. A hush fell over the room. I could feel the weight of my confession. But I was wrong. I was a fool, because in that moment of my greatest pride and cruelty, I was shown a mercy I did not deserve. Her son was healed, and I was broken. But the very thing I tried to shatter, the very faith I mocked, was the only thing that could put me back together. Tears were streaming down my face now, but I didn't care. What I rejected is what raised me from the dead. I'm not here to talk about a change in religion. I'm here to talk about a change of heart, a heart that was made of stone, that God, through the intercession of a loving mother, somehow turned back to flesh. I looked out at them, these simple, faithful people. I just wanted to say, "I'm sorry and thank you." If this story has touched a part of your own journey, If you believe in the power of a second chance, in a love that mends what is broken, please let me know by hitting that like button and turning on the notification bell so you don't miss what we share next. This journey of faith is one we walk together, and I'd be so grateful if you would share in the comments a single word that describes what faith means to you. Your testimony matters. Thank you for listening.